Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I should have known something was off that night. It wasn't just the fact that I was alone in my apartment, nor the emptiness that echoed through the quiet streets below. It wasn't even the usual hum of the city that made me uneasy. No, it was the sudden sense of being watched. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee in the dim light of the late evening, the kind of light that made everything look softer, more distant. It was just another uneventful night. I had no plans, no appointments, nothing pressing. My life was simple, or at least I had convinced myself it was. I had been staring out of the window for a while, lost in thought, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow moving in the wind. But then I saw it again, a figure standing across the street in the apartment across from mine. It was impossible to make out the details from that distance. It was just there. A silhouette, unmoving. A person, or at least it looked like a person. It was hard to tell. Something about it seemed wrong. I didn't think much of it at first. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone passing by. But when I looked again, it was still there, watching. I could feel a chill crawl up my spine, though the room was warm. The figure was standing motionless, its gaze directed straight at my window, though I couldn't tell if it was really looking at me. I shifted uneasily in my chair. The logical part of me told me that it was just a person, maybe someone who lived in that building or someone who had paused for a moment. But there was something about it that unsettled me. A feeling. A presence. I glanced away, trying to shake off the feeling. But when I looked back, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly got up and moved closer to the window, squinting to see more clearly. The figure didn't move. It was still just a shape in the dark. But there was something about it now that made my throat tighten. The way it stood, too still. Too quiet. My mind raced. Was I imagining this? Could it be? My own reflection in the window was casting a shadow over the scene, warping it. But no, I wasn't imagining it. The figure was still there, just outside my view, watching. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I moved to the other side of the room, trying to push the creeping anxiety away. It was late, I was tired, maybe I was just paranoid. But when I glanced back at the window, the figure had moved. Just slightly. It was now closer to the window. The space between us had shortened, even though I hadn't seen the person move. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was impossible. No one could move that fast, not in the dark, not without making a sound. I turned my gaze back to the street. The figure was gone. Just gone. I waited a moment, half expecting it to reappear, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life in that building. Only the darkened windows staring back at me, empty. Still. The air around me felt heavier, as though the weight of the silence was pressing down on me. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling. My eyes darted to the window every few minutes, even though I tried to busy myself with other things. I couldn't explain why, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. Was I being watched? Had I imagined it? Or was there someone out there? I didn't know. But I couldn't stop the unease crawling under my skin, burrowing deeper with each passing hour. I turned off the lights and lay in bed, trying to sleep, but the image of that shadow in the window kept haunting me. I knew I had to go to sleep eventually, but I couldn't help it. My eyes flicked back toward the window. And then, just as I was about to close my eyes, I saw it again. The figure. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving. Slowly. And it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was more. It had a shape, a form. It wasn't human. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. I lay there, paralyzed, watching, waiting. I couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body was frozen, my chest tight, my mind racing. The figure across the street, no longer just a shadow, was moving, getting closer with each passing second. I blinked hard, as if my mind could will the image to vanish, but it didn't. It couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on that window. The figure, whatever it was, moved in jerky, unsettling motions, almost as if it was trying to blend in with the darkness. I could barely make out its outline. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and it seemed to bend in ways that didn't feel natural. A chill coursed through me, sharp and sudden, like icy fingers creeping down my spine. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't alone. Something was out there. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion. Just a trick of the mind, a moment of fear messing with my perception. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, now clearly standing at the window, my window. It had moved. It had crossed the street. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell was happening? My apartment was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be my haven, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world, but now it felt like a cage. Was I losing my mind? The rational part of me screamed that it had to be a mistake, a misinterpretation. But as I glanced back at the window, the figure was still there, its shape now more defined. A person? Or something else? The air felt thick now, suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to turn away from the window, even though every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run. But where could I go? My hands were trembling as I picked up my phone and fumbled for the number to call the police. But when I tried to dial, my fingers wouldn't cooperate. They were shaking too badly, too erratically. I couldn't think straight. I glanced back toward the window, hoping the figure was gone, hoping this was all just a nightmare. But it hadn't moved. It was still there, staring directly at me. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I couldn't breathe properly. My vision blurred with the rising panic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Maybe it was someone in the building, playing some sick joke. Maybe it was all just a horrible coincidence. But what if it wasn't? I forced myself to focus, forcing my hand to steady enough to grab my phone. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me this was a mistake. But as I opened the phone's contact list, the screen flickered. Just for a second. I blinked, looking at the screen as the image distorted for a brief moment, as if someone was tampering with the signal, as if someone didn't want me to call for help. I looked back at the window. The figure was gone. Gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, only to feel a sudden wave of dizziness, my mind refusing to keep up with the sudden confusion. Could it have been a trick of the light? Had I imagined it all? But then, just as I let my guard down, I heard it. A soft tap. A gentle tap. It was coming from the window. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly turned toward the sound, my stomach sinking deeper with every inch my gaze moved. No. No, it couldn't be. I wasn't imagining it. The figure had returned. Now, it was standing right there, on the other side of the glass, just inches away from me. I could see it clearly now, the shape of its face, the blank, dark eyes, and the way it tilted its head ever so slightly. Its face was twisted, distorted. It looked almost like a mask, not human, not anything I recognized. My body froze again, completely paralyzed by the sight. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, tangled in the fear that kept me rooted to the spot. The tap came again, louder this time. It was like someone knocking on a door. But I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't expecting this. The figure's hand was pressed against the glass, its long, spindly fingers splayed out. It felt like it was touching me through the window, like it was reaching out to pull me in, to drag me across the room and into whatever dark hole it came from. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall behind me. The room felt too small now, the walls too close, as though everything around me was collapsing inward. It was right there, just on the other side of the glass, staring. But I could hear something else now. It wasn't just the tapping. It was breathing. Soft, slow, almost too soft, like the sound of air escaping from between cracked lips. It came from the other side of the window, like the figure was trying to breathe the same air as me. I couldn't look away, even though I wanted to. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment, to do something. But my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in some kind of invisible vice. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Just like that. One moment, it was there, staring through the glass. And the next, the window was empty. I blinked, shaking, heart still racing in my chest. The night outside was as dark and silent as it had been before. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified. What was happening? What did it want? I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But I knew one thing, it wasn't over. Not yet. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wall, still staring at the empty window. My breath was shallow, quick, as if I had run a marathon. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with tension. My thoughts were racing, every possible explanation spinning in my mind, none of them made sense. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, something my mind conjured up because of the stress, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this apartment. I could feel it in my bones. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The silence in the room pressed down on me, oppressive and suffocating. For a long time, I just sat there, unable to move, as though if I did, I would break the fragile peace that had somehow returned. But the silence, it wasn't comforting, it was unnerving. The kind of quiet that feels wrong, as though something is about to shatter it. I picked up my phone again, my fingers trembling so violently that I had to steady them with my other hand. My mind screamed at me to call someone, anyone. But my contact list seemed useless, the names on the screen just empty. My thoughts were scattered, as if everything I had known was beginning to unravel. I glanced back toward the window, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing. The street outside was as still as it had been before. No movement. No sign of anyone. I let out a slow breath, attempting to calm my racing heart. I had to stop this. I had to regain control, or this would consume me. But then, I heard it. A sound. A faint scraping. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. But it wasn't coming from inside the apartment. No, this was coming from outside, near the window. I froze. My mind refused to believe what I was hearing. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind, the creaking of the old building settling. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was there. Someone was moving, scraping, along the edge of the building, just outside. I pushed myself off the floor, moving slowly toward the window, each step heavy with dread. My heart pounded in my chest, echoing in my ears. With each movement of the sound, my skin prickled, my senses sharpened to an almost unbearable level. The scraping stopped for a moment, and the stillness that followed was even worse. The tension was thick, as if the world was holding its breath with me. I reached the window and peered out, praying that there would be nothing. Just the empty street. But my eyes met something else. A figure. It was standing in the shadows, at the edge of the building, barely visible in the dim streetlight. But I could see it, the shape, the outline of someone, something, watching me. It was too far away to make out details, but I could feel its presence. It felt like it was staring right at me, the same way it had done earlier, from the other side of the street. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing again. I didn't know what to do. The figure was too far for me to confront, but too close to ignore. I could hear my own breathing now, ragged and desperate, as I turned away from the window, my back pressed against the wall once more. What was it? What did it want? I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of this apartment and never look back. But where would I go? The fear was paralyzing. There was no way to outrun this thing, whatever it was. The scraping sound returned, this time louder, like fingernails against glass. My heart skipped. I ran back to the window, my hand shaking as I pulled the curtain back. The street was empty. The figure was gone. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was dread. What was it doing? What was it waiting for? My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message from an unknown number. I stared at the screen for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of it. It was a single line of text. I see you. My stomach churned. I dropped the phone, the device crashing onto the floor with a dull thud. My hand went instinctively to my throat, as if I could choke down the rising panic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But that message, it couldn't have been a coincidence. I stumbled back again, this time collapsing into the couch, my hands clutching the sides. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I wanted to close my eyes, to make it all go away, but I couldn't. My mind wouldn't let me. And deep down, I knew the figure wasn't gone. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. I could feel it. And now, I couldn't escape. I sat motionless, staring at the screen of my phone. The message still lingered there, almost mocking me. I see you. I felt the words carving their way into my mind, echoing in my skull with an intensity that made my teeth ache. My fingers twitched involuntarily, and I reached down to pick the phone up, but I hesitated, the air around me thickening. The weight of the silence, the kind of silence that's not just empty but pressing, was unbearable. Every corner of the apartment felt like it was closing in, the walls drawing closer, inch by inch, making the air grow hotter. I glanced around, half expecting something to shift, something to move when my eyes weren't on it. I set the phone down on the coffee table, deliberately forcing myself to stop looking at it. But the words were still there, burned into my vision. I could hear them in my mind even when I wasn't looking at the screen. I see you. I stood up, feeling the cold floor against the soles of my feet, grounding me for a brief moment. The faint buzzing of the fridge in the corner was the only sound that dared to break the suffocating quiet. I tried to think, to reason, but the more I did, the less sense everything made. Who would send a message like that? The phone was the only thing that had connected me to the outside world, yet now it felt like an anchor, tethering me to something I didn't want to understand. The tapping began again. At first, I thought it was the pipes or some other noise in the building, but no, it was a pattern. A rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the window pane, soft and slow, almost deliberate. It sent a shiver down my spine. I took a few steps toward the window, but stopped myself before I could pull the curtain back. What if it's still out there? What if it's waiting for me to look? The idea that I might be watched, even now, in this moment of supposed safety, was too much. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, my heart racing. My thoughts were jumbled, torn between wanting to confront whatever was happening and the sheer terror of discovering the truth. What if it wasn't a person at all? What if it was something else? I needed to get out of here. The apartment felt like a cage now, each shadow stretching longer and darker, the corners of the room growing more ominous. My mind raced through the possibility of running, of leaving, but that thought was cut short. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body betraying me. The knocking intensified. Not just at the window now. It was coming from all around the apartment, a soft, insistent tapping like fingernails against the walls. My eyes darted to the door, to the windows, as if looking for an escape route, but there was no way out. It's too late, I thought. I couldn't move. The fear was thick, suffocating, and my chest felt like it was going to cave in. Sweat trickled down my spine as I turned toward the door, and that's when I saw it. The figure was back. This time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, creeping closer to the window. Its shape blurred against the darkness, the faint outline of a body, distorted in the way shadows don't follow the rules of light. My breath caught in my throat. It's not real. It can't be real. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but my voice was caught in my throat, the words trapped somewhere between fear and disbelief. My legs were trembling beneath me, yet I couldn't look away. My eyes were glued to that window, drawn to the figure that moved without sound, without a single breath. The figure's face, if it even had one, was hidden in the dark, obscured by the shadows, but I knew, somehow, that it was looking at me. I felt my heart thudding in my chest, every beat a reminder that I was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. The knocking grew louder, the sound now an almost constant barrage on the walls, pounding, tapping, clawing at the edges of my sanity. The rhythm was broken only by the slight rustle of movement, a subtle shifting of something just beyond my sight. I stumbled backward, my feet dragging as I fell onto the couch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was no escape. The apartment, my own home, had become a prison, every corner darkened, every shadow alive with the threat of something lurking just out of sight. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know how it was getting in, or why it was doing this to me. The more I thought about it, the less I understood. I felt it, the pressure, the weight of its presence, pressing against me like the walls were closing in, like the entire world was watching me and waiting. I could almost feel its breath, cold and unearthly, against my neck, as though it had crossed the threshold and was now standing just behind me. And then the phone buzzed again. I didn't need to look. I already knew what it would say. I heard it in my mind, loud and clear, without needing to read it. I see you. I am coming for you. The room seemed to narrow, the air thinning with every breath. I looked at the door one last time, but there was no escape. The figure wasn't just outside. It was inside now. I could feel it, creeping closer, closer still. This wasn't just happening outside my window. It was inside my mind. And it was never going to leave. I was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me with every shallow breath. My chest was tight, each breath a struggle, as though the very air had thickened, turned to something heavy and oppressive. I should have left, should have run, but I couldn't move. It was as if the apartment had become a trap, a place where my legs refused to carry me out of danger. The figure was still out there. I could feel it watching me. Not just from the window, no, it had crossed that boundary. It had infiltrated my thoughts, my mind, twisted itself into the corners of my every waking moment. The longer I stayed, the more I realized that it wasn't just a physical presence. It had infected the very air in this place. My gaze flickered nervously to the door. There it stood. The place that should have been my escape. But the fear locked my limbs in place, and I could feel its fingers creeping around my mind, wrapping themselves tighter. I wasn't sure if it was the figure itself or the terror it had awakened that kept me rooted to the spot. Either way, I was stuck. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. The silence weighed heavily on my ears, the absence of noise now a louder sound than anything that had come before. I strained my ears, listening, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever it wasn't going anywhere. And then the lights flickered. It was so subtle at first that I almost convinced myself it was just the power playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. The dim glow from the overhead light danced across the room, flickering again and again until it was a strobe. In and out. In and out. My reflection in the window, though I hadn't looked directly at it, shifted with each flash. Too quick. Too distorted. I stumbled forward, my hand grabbing the curtain, pulling it back slightly, just enough to get a glimpse of the figure, but not enough to see it fully. I wasn't sure what I expected to see. I didn't want to know. But my feet were moving, my body acting on its own, controlled by the fear. And there it was. Not standing. Not moving. Just there. I saw it, clearer now, in the flickering light. The figure was no longer a shadow or distortion of the mind. It had form unmistakable, yet impossible to comprehend. The face was still hidden, but it was the rest of it that caught my attention. The hands. Pale, elongated, with fingers that stretched too long, too thin, like they had been bent out of shape. And the way it stood, too still, almost unnaturally rigid, as though it were waiting, watching. My heart pounded louder, faster, and I pulled away from the window, turning on my heel. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to shrink even more, my vision narrowing, the room distorting, like I was underwater. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to the floor, my hands trembling as I pressed them to my face. I needed to leave. I needed to run. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere. The thought was consuming, louder than the panic in my chest. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, shaking my head as if to clear it. When I opened them again, the figure had moved. But it wasn't just a small shift. It was closer. Much closer. I could hear its breath now. It was faint, but it was there, slow, uneven, like a wheeze. Each breath came in soft bursts that seemed to resonate deep within the core of my being. I froze, straining my ears, waiting for the next sound. And then, silence again. I stood up slowly, moving away from the window. Every part of me screamed to run, but the terror that rooted me to the floor was stronger than any impulse to flee. I could feel it there, the presence behind me, the tension in the room like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. I backed away, step by step, toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly now that I could barely turn the handle, but I managed it. I had to get out. I stepped into the hallway, the floor cold beneath my feet. The building felt too big now, too empty. Every corner was filled with the weight of something unseen, something hidden. The halls stretched out before me, but they didn't feel like my halls anymore. They felt foreign, unnatural. The low hum of the building's pipes, once comforting, now sounded like whispers, faint murmurs that seemed to be coming from all directions. I wasn't alone. The door to the stairwell was just ahead. I reached for it, my breath shallow, my heart racing. The door creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound that made my skin crawl. I stepped through, my feet moving faster now. The stairwell was darker than I remembered, the dim light from the overhead bulb casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. The sound of my own footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence, growing louder as I ascended the stairs. But something was off. There were no sounds beyond my own. No cars outside. No people walking past. The world outside had fallen into complete stillness. I had to get out of here. I repeated it to myself, like a mantra, but the words were beginning to lose their meaning. The terror was starting to consume me from the inside out, leaving nothing but the hollow emptiness of dread. And that's when I heard it again. That tapping. The rhythmic sound that had followed me from the moment I'd first seen it. It wasn't outside anymore. It was coming from within the building. I froze in place, every hair on my body standing on end. The tapping was no longer distant. It was right next to me, echoing down the stairwell. Slow. Deliberate. Like footsteps. It's following me. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, and my legs finally obeyed, pushing me into a frantic sprint up the stairs. I had no idea where I was going anymore, just away. Away from that thing. The tapping grew louder. I pushed myself harder, the pounding of my feet against the stairs matching the pounding in my chest. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing visible. Still, I could feel it. It was there. I reached the top of the stairs and bolted for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. And just before I stepped into the hallway, I heard one final, sickening sound. A whisper right in my ear, "I see you." Where did he go? That question kept echoing through my mind, louder than anything I'd heard in weeks. Everyone knew Frank, the mailman who delivered our letters without fail, day after day, year after year. Quiet, dependable, always with a smile on his face, even when the weather was at its worst. There was something oddly comforting about his presence, like the ticking of a clock or the hum of a refrigerator. You didn't realize how important something was until it wasn't there anymore. It had been 5 days since Frank had last shown up at his usual time, his postal truck rumbling down our street like clockwork. I noticed it immediately, but I figured there had been some sort of mistake. Maybe a family emergency, maybe an illness, I thought. People miss work sometimes. But as the days dragged on and no one heard from him, the questions started to build, like a snowball gaining speed and size. I didn't know Frank well, but I saw him nearly every day. I knew he lived alone, in a small house on the edge of town. He had no family here. No close friends that I knew of. He was a man of routine. His absence was unsettling, but I pushed it to the back of my mind, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than an odd circumstance. That was until the letters started. It was the third day without Frank when I found the first one. A plain, white envelope slipped through the crack of my door. It was unusual to receive mail at night, especially from someone like Frank, who would have never been this late with his rounds. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a strange chill run through me. I turned it over, but there was no return address. No name. Just my address, scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I broke the seal. Inside, there was only one word, written in the same jagged script, run. It didn't make sense. I stared at the word for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this some kind of joke? Had Frank gotten into some kind of trouble? The message made my skin crawl, sending a shiver down my spine. But still, I pushed it aside as nothing more than an odd prank. That night, I tried to sleep, but the word run lingered in my mind. It was like a whisper, always just out of reach, but somehow, it was there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The air in my room felt heavy, and I kept hearing things that made no sense, faint tapping noises on the walls, like fingers scratching at the surface. The second letter came the next day. This time, I was standing by my window when I saw the same white envelope, just like the first, slipping under my neighbor's door. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed to the door to grab it before anyone else had the chance. I felt the cold weight of it in my hand, and before I even opened it, I could tell something was wrong. It was heavier than before. Inside, there was no word this time. Just a drawing. A crude sketch of a man with wide, staring eyes. He was drawn in a way that made his face look distorted, almost grotesque. The eyes were huge, bulging out of his face, and the lines were messy, as if the artist hadn't taken the time to be precise. I turned it over, expecting to find something more, but there was nothing. No signature, no explanation. Just that disturbing image. My nerves were shot. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was Frank sending these strange letters? Was it some kind of cry for help? Had he been in danger all along? And if he was, why wasn't anyone else concerned? I couldn't let it go. I had to find out where he was. I had to understand what was going on. So, I did what anyone would do in that situation. I went to his house. I hadn't expected to find much at Frank's house. After all, what could a small, quiet postal worker have hidden that was worth finding? But there was something pulling me to it. That nagging feeling, the same one that had driven me to open the letters, to chase answers when I knew I should have stayed away. The walk to Frank's house wasn't long. His small, brick bungalow sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between the woods and a patch of overgrown grass. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches creaking in the wind. A typical autumn day, cool and still, but it felt wrong, unnatural. I could see his mailbox from the street, still upright, still in place, though no letters had been delivered in days. The neighborhood seemed strangely quiet today, more so than usual. Not a single person in sight. I approached the front door cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. The house looked perfectly normal from the outside, just as it always had. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing out of place. I knocked first, thinking Frank might have just been sick or hiding out. There was no answer. After a long moment of hesitation, I tried the door handle. It turned with a soft click. I wasn't sure if I should go in. Was this trespassing? I couldn't tell. But the letters, they had to mean something. I couldn't ignore them. So, I stepped inside. The air was stale and thick, like the house had been closed off for too long. The smell of dust and wood lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of something metallic, like iron. It made me shiver. I took a step forward, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. Everything inside looked just like I remembered from the few times I'd passed by: a small living room with worn furniture, a kitchen to the side with a half-empty mug on the counter. But there was no sign of Frank. I checked every room. The bathroom was untouched. The bedroom had no signs of struggle, nothing unusual at all, except for the complete absence of Frank. I wandered deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty silence. That's when I noticed it. On the kitchen table, tucked beneath a pile of unopened mail, was another envelope. I didn't even need to pick it up to know it was from Frank. The handwriting was unmistakable. I held my breath as I opened it, feeling the familiar sense of dread creep over me. Inside was a single phrase, written with uneven strokes. "He's still watching." I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't just some weird, cryptic message. Something was happening here, and it was too big to ignore. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was a presence in this house. I could feel it now, something I hadn't noticed before. A low, constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, like the sound of an old machine running in the background. I stood there for a long time, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then, I heard something. A faint scraping sound coming from the attic. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't checked the attic. I don't know what compelled me to go up there, but my feet were already moving before I could stop them. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way to the attic door. I didn't have a flashlight, so the darkness inside swallowed me whole as I pushed open the door. The attic was small, crammed with boxes and old furniture. It was colder than the rest of the house, and the air was thick with dust. I strained my eyes to make out shapes in the dark, but I couldn't see much. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I moved forward, brushing aside a pile of old sheets draped over forgotten objects. And then I saw it. A figure. A man, hunched over and standing completely still. He was facing the wall, his back to me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his presence, thick and oppressive. He was wearing Frank's uniform. The same blue shirt, the same cap. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Suddenly, he turned his head. His face, those eyes, were wide, bloodshot, as if they had been staring at something for days, weeks even. His expression was vacant, hollow, like someone who had seen too much. He didn't blink. He didn't say anything. I stumbled backward, my legs buckling beneath me. The letters, the warnings, it all clicked into place. Frank hadn't just disappeared. He was here, but something was wrong. So terribly wrong. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted down the stairs, through the living room, and out the door. I didn't stop to look back until I was safely on the street, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, silent again. But I knew Frank wasn't the same. The figure in the attic, it wasn't Frank anymore. The air outside felt cooler now, the chill biting into my skin as I walked aimlessly down the street. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow. I couldn't get the image of Frank, no, whatever it was in that attic, out of my head. His eyes had been too wide, too empty. It was like staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back at me. I had to know more. I couldn't walk away from this. But where to go next? I tried calling the local police, but I couldn't bring myself to explain everything over the phone. What would I say? Hey, I went into the missing man's house and found, well, I'm not sure, but it wasn't him anymore. I think something is wrong with him. No, that wouldn't work. They'd laugh me off, or worse, chalk it up to some kind of mental breakdown on my part. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I had to push further. I stood there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by the weight of my own indecision. But eventually, I realized there was no turning back. I had to return. Something inside me, call it guilt or perhaps obsession, compelled me to go back to Frank's house. I needed to understand what was going on. What had happened to Frank? What had become of him? I didn't want to go back inside, but I had no choice. I had already crossed a line, and now there was no escaping the truth, however ugly it might be. So, I found myself walking toward the house once again, the shadows stretching long across the sidewalk as the evening sun dipped lower in the sky. The world around me felt distant, muted, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. As I approached the front door, my eyes automatically drifted to the mailbox. It was slightly ajar, a piece of yellow paper sticking out from the crack. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I pulled it free, my eyes scanning the contents. It was another note. I can't leave. They won't let me. The handwriting was the same as before, Frank's. Or at least, it looked like Frank's. But the message felt different. More desperate, more broken. Whoever had written this wasn't the same person who had left me those cryptic notes before. I stood frozen, the note crumpled in my hand. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. Who was Frank trying to warn? What did he mean, they won't let me? Was he still alive, trapped somewhere, or had whatever replaced him taken full control? With trembling hands, I shoved the note into my pocket, unwilling to look at it any longer. I couldn't stand it. The need to know, to understand what was happening, had become unbearable. I tried the door again, this time bracing myself for whatever might be inside. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I entered the house quietly, my breath echoing in the silence. The place was even more suffocating than before, like the air itself had become thick with dread. I glanced around the living room again, hoping for some sign, anything that might explain what had happened. I moved toward the hallway, the light flickering above me. There was a door at the end of the hallway, half open, a faint, sickly light spilling from within. It seemed to beckon me, like it knew I was there, like it had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The room was small, a storage closet really, but what was inside made my blood run cold. On the floor, scattered across the ground like someone had thrown them in haste, were dozens of letters. Letters from Frank, from the post office, from neighbors. And scattered in between them were photographs. Black and white, blurry and grainy, but unmistakable. They were pictures of me, taken from different angles, at different times, in various places. There was one of me leaving my apartment. One of me walking into the store. One of me standing by the bus stop. And there was another that made my stomach churn. It was a picture of me standing in Frank's front yard. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. It was too much. I couldn't handle it. I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I froze. There was something in the distance, a figure standing by the edge of the street. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. It was like they had been standing there, watching me, the entire time. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back, not even once. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted down the street, my legs burning with each step. The distant figure hadn't moved, but I could feel it. They were still there, still watching, as if they knew where I was going, as if they had been there all along. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment. My chest heaved as I slammed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing with the images, the notes, the pictures. It was too late. There was no escaping this. Whatever Frank had become, whatever had taken over him, it was already too close. I had been a part of it from the start. And now, they knew I was onto them. The question wasn't whether I could escape, it was whether I could survive long enough to understand what was happening to me. And if I could, if I even wanted to know, what would be left of me? The night was oppressive, like something that was suffocating the very air around me. The small apartment, once a sanctuary from the noise of the world outside, now felt more like a prison. The walls seemed to close in with each passing moment, as if they were aware of my every thought, my every movement. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional creak of the building's old wooden frame or the distant hum of traffic. But I wasn't fooled. I knew something was wrong. The photograph still burned in my mind, the woman with Frank's eyes. The unsettling connection was undeniable. It was as if Frank had been part of something much larger than just a simple disappearance. It was as if we had been part of something all along. I sat at the edge of the bed, my fingers trembling as I stared at the torn photo on the coffee table. The fear was beginning to twist inside me, spreading like a sickness. My mind raced in circles, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any answers. Every lead I had followed, every step I took, only brought me deeper into this web of mystery and dread. But then, in a flash, the thought struck me. What if the key to this whole thing wasn't in the past? What if the answer was right in front of me, in the present? Frank had been in this neighborhood for so long. But had anyone noticed anything strange before his disappearance? Had anyone else seen what I had? I grabbed my coat and headed out the door. The night had grown colder, and the chill in the air seemed to press down on me as I walked. My footsteps echoed in the empty streets, the sound hollow and distant. I made my way to the corner store, a place I had passed countless times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't undo. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The clerk, a man I'd seen many times but never spoken to, glanced up at me as I walked in. He gave me a tired smile before returning to his task. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, then something darker, something hidden. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I need to ask you about Frank," I said, trying to sound casual, but my heart was racing. "Did you know him?" "The mailman. The one who's gone missing." The clerk stiffened, his expression freezing. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could feel my pulse quickening. "Why are you asking about him?" The question came out sharp, almost accusatory. I hesitated. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days suddenly surged forward. Was it possible the clerk knew more than he was letting on? Had he seen something? Or worse, was he involved in Frank's disappearance? I just need to understand what happened. People are talking, but no one knows anything for sure. What do you know? The clerk looked around nervously, his eyes darting toward the door. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You should stop asking about him," he said. "Trust me. It's not safe. There are things you don't want to know." My breath caught in my throat. "Things you don't want to know." The words echoed in my head like a warning. He knew something. He had to. "What do you mean? What's going on?" I pressed. The clerk's face hardened, and for a moment I thought he was going to refuse to say anything more. But then, with a glance that told me he was making a decision, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "Frank wasn't the man you thought he was. None of us are. He was changed. People like him, they don't just disappear. They become part of something else. And now it's your turn." I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Your turn? What did he mean by that? Was I already caught in whatever this thing was, whatever Frank had become? I felt my stomach twist with a cold, terrifying certainty. Before I could say anything else, the clerk stood up quickly, wiping his hands on his apron. "You need to go," he said urgently. "Don't ask questions. Just go. They're watching you." I backed away, my mind racing, my body numb. I stumbled out of the store, my heart hammering in my chest. Who was watching me? Who was the clerk talking about? It was becoming clear, whatever was happening, it was much bigger than Frank, bigger than any of us. It had been going on for a long time, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed me, too. I had no answers, only more questions. And the more I searched, the more I realized I was sinking deeper into a nightmare with no escape. I was being dragged in, whether I wanted it or not. The thought gripped me with a cold terror, but as I looked around the empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was moving in the shadows. I wasn't sure if it was them, whoever they were, or if it was the darkness itself, closing in on me. But I could feel their eyes on me, I could feel them getting closer, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.